Bran Castle gets the tourists. 2.5 million of them every year. The gift shops, the garlic souvenirs, the fairy tale turrets pressed onto 1,000 postcards. Bram Stoker never set foot inside it. Vlad III almost certainly never slept there. And the man whose shadow built the legend died 200 miles to the south, in a fortress almost nobody visits. 80 miles north of Bucharest, on a knife of limestone above the Argeș River, sit the broken walls of a citadel reached only by 480 stone steps cut into the cliff. No road, no coach park, no gift shop. This is where Vlad Dracula actually lived. This is where, in the spring of 1457, he marched the noblemen of Targoviste in their Easter finery and worked them to death rebuilding his walls. This is where the forest of stakes grew tall enough to stop an army of 60,000. They call the other place Dracula's castle. They are looking in the wrong place. To understand what happened at Poenari, we need to go back further than Vlad. The Carpathian Mountains form a great curving wall across the middle of Romania, and along the southern face of that wall, narrow river valleys cut north into the rock. These valleys are the only roads through the mountains. Whoever holds the valleys, holds the country. Whoever holds the cliffs above the valleys, holds the valleys. In the 13th century, 1,000 years after Rome had abandoned the province of Dacia, the people who lived in this land had no kingdom of their own. They had villages, they had monasteries, they had a half-remembered language, and they had a constant low-grade fear of whoever came down the passes next. The Cumans came, the Tatars came, the Mongols came, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, the Wallachians. Around the year 1240, somewhere in the chaos of the Mongol invasions, men began carrying stone up a particular limestone cliff above the Argeș Valley. The cliff was 1,000 feet high and roughly the shape of a hatchet blade. Two sides dropped sheer into the gorge. The third side rose to a forested ridge that was difficult to attack. The fourth side connected to the mountain by a thin spine of rock barely wide enough to walk single file. It was a place no army would ever choose to besiege. This is where they built the first citadel, a small wooden fortification replaced within a generation by stone. A keep, a watchtower, a curtain wall. The names of the men who built it were never recorded. The kingdom they built it for did not yet exist, but by 1330, the kingdom did exist. Wallachia. Stretched along the south face of the Carpathians, ruled by a line of princes called voivodes, recognized for a few years by the Hungarian crown to the north, and then, increasingly, by the rising Ottoman power to the south. The voivodes lived in Curtea de Argeș, in Târgoviște, in Bucharest. The fortress on the cliff was not their main residence. It was their bolt hole, the place they ran to when the cities burned. For 100 years, that's what Poenari was, a refuge, a retreat, a way to survive the next invasion long enough for the invaders to grow bored and leave. By the 1430s, the fortress had begun to crumble. The wooden roofs were gone, the towers were filling with weeds. The voivodes who came after the founding family did not invest in it. There was no money for stone. This is the citadel that a young prince would inherit. Half ruined, half forgotten. Sitting on a cliff above a river, waiting for someone with a particular kind of imagination to see what it could become. The prince's name was Vlad. He was, at this point, about 11 years old, and he was living in a tent on the edge of the Ottoman Empire, 1,200 miles from home, trying not to die. Imagine a boy who has never seen the citadel that will one day be his, sitting in a foreign palace, listening to a language not his own, learning that his survival depends entirely on the mood of a man who could have him strangled before breakfast. That boy is the reason we are talking about Poenari at all. Vlad III was born in the city of Sighisoara, in Transylvania, around the winter of 1431. His father, Vlad II, was a son of the great Wallachian prince Mircea the Elder. His mother's name is contested in the records, and may have been a Moldavian princess called Knujna. His older brother was Mircea. His younger brother was Radu, called the Handsome, who will return to this story later, with consequences neither boy could have foreseen. The family was minor royalty in a kingdom barely 2 generations old, and Vlad II had a problem. His throne, the Wallachian voivodeship, was caught between 2 empires, and both of them wanted him to choose a side. To the north and west, The Kingdom of Hungary under Sigismund of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor, demanded loyalty as a Christian ally. To the south, across the Danube, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad II demanded tribute, hostages, and obedience as a tributary state. Each side promised the throne. Each side promised assassination if Vlad II picked wrong. In 1431, the year his son was born, Vlad II was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric society Sigismund had founded to defend Christianity against the Ottoman advance. The Romanian word for dragon was Drac, and so Vlad II became known as Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. His son took the diminutive, Draculaia, son of the dragon. It would, 450 years later, be misread by an Irish novelist who spoke no Romanian. For a few years, Vlad Dracul tried to balance both empires. It did not work. By 1442, Murad II had grown impatient with Wallachian double-dealing, and he summoned Vlad Dracul to the Ottoman court at Gallipoli. The summons was a trap. Vlad Dracul was arrested on arrival, held in chains, and released only after agreeing to leave 2 of his sons in Edirne as guarantees of his future loyalty. The 2 sons were Vlad, 11 years old, and Radu, about 7. We have no contemporary description of what either boy felt as they were handed over. We have only the fact that Vlad survived 6 years in that captivity, and Radu survived 11. We have the Ottoman court records showing that the boys were educated alongside the sons of Ottoman nobility. They learned Turkish, they learned Persian, they learned the Quran, they learned the geometry of fortification, the logistics of moving an army, the psychology of command, and, according to a handful of much later sources written by Vlad's enemies and therefore needing to be read with caution, Vlad was beaten often, frequently enough that the German chronicler Michael Beheim, writing in the 1460s, attributed Vlad's later cruelty to the manner in which he had been kept by the Turks. Whether Beheim was correct or whether he was projecting Christian anxieties about the morally corrupting East, no one alive today can say. But the boys went into Edirne untraumatized. At least we have no contrary evidence. And Vlad came out, 6 years later, a different kind of person. In 1447, while Vlad was still a hostage at Edirne, news arrived from Wallachia. His father had been ambushed in the marshes near Beltany and killed. His older brother Mircea had been captured by the boyars, the Wallachian nobility, taken to Târgoviste, blinded with red-hot iron pokers, and buried alive. Both murders had been carried out by a boyar faction led by a rival voivode called Vladislav II. The boyars had supported the murder. The boyars had blinded his brother. The boyars had buried Mircea alive, while Mircea, presumably, was still screaming. Vlad was 16 years old when the news reached him in Edirne. We do not know what he said or whether he said anything. We know only what he did, 10 years later, when he came back. The boyars who had killed his father and brother are dead. Their wives and children are at Poenari, in their wedding silks, with their hands raw from carrying stone. But to understand how he got from a tent in Edirne to a citadel on a cliff, we need to follow the road he took home. In the winter of 1448, the Ottomans decided to use Vlad. Vladislav II, the boyar-backed voivode who had murdered Vlad's father, had switched sides and joined the Hungarian crusader John Hunyadi in an anti-Ottoman campaign. The Ottomans wanted Wallachia back under their control. They had a son of the rightful dynasty sitting in Edirne. He was 17. He spoke perfect Turkish. He hated the men who held his throne. He was, in modern terms, a perfect proxy. The Ottomans gave Vlad a small force, perhaps a few thousand men, and sent him north. He crossed the Danube. He marched on Târgoviste. He found the city undefended. Vladislav was off fighting Hunyadi at Kosovo, and he walked in and took the crown. He held it for approximately 2 months. When Hunyadi returned, Vlad fled north into Moldavia, then into the Carpathian passes, then into hiding in Transylvania. He was, again, a teenager without a country, a king without a throne. The difference was that this time he had tasted what it felt like to give the orders. He spent the next 8 years moving between the courts of Moldavia and Hungary, sometimes welcome, sometimes barely tolerated. In Moldavia he became close with his cousin Stephen, who would later be known as Stephen the Great, the most famous of all Moldavian voivodes. In Hungary, he eventually managed the seemingly impossible. He convinced John Hunyadi himself, the same crusader who had driven him from Wallachia, to back him for the throne again. Hunyadi was practical. Vladislav II had become inconvenient. Vlad was useful. In the summer of 1456, Hunyadi died of plague during the defense of Belgrade. The political situation in Wallachia collapsed. Vlad rode south with a Transylvanian force. In August of 1456, near the town of Tergishor, he caught Vladislav II in single combat and killed him. The sources differ on the manner of death. Some say a duel, some say an ambush. One Saxon chronicle, hostile in every detail, says that Vlad personally beheaded Vladislav and threw his body in a ditch. He was 25 years old. He had been preparing for this throne for 15 years. And the men who had murdered his father and buried his brother alive were still, most of them, in their townhouses in Targovishte, raising their children, conducting their business, expecting the new voivode to need them just as the previous one had. This was their mistake. There is a phrase the Romanian historian Constantin Rezicevici uses to describe Vlad's first year in power. He calls it Anul Liniștit, the quiet year. For 9 months, Vlad gave no sign of what was coming. He met with the boyars, he listened to their counsel, he attended their feasts. He confirmed their land grants. He kept his face calm and his voice low, and he made a list. We don't have the list. We have instead the events of one particular morning in the spring of 1457, the morning after Easter, in the great hall of the prince's palace at Targovishte. Imagine the great hall. The candles are still smoking from the Easter vigil. The boyar families have come in their best clothes, silk gowns brought across the Black Sea from Constantinople before the city fell, jewelry from Venice, fur cloaks from Moldavia. They have brought their wives, their grown sons, their daughters, their grandchildren. The voivode has invited them all. He has been generous all winter. He is generous again now. There are roasted boars on the tables, and pheasants, and bread shaped like crowns, and wine in such quantities that the youngest children have to be carried out. The voivode rises. He thanks them for their loyalty. Then he asks a question. How many princes, he says, have ruled in your lifetime? The old men begin to count. The story comes to us from multiple chroniclers, in multiple languages, with details that contradict each other on the small things and agree on the big ones. The German-Saxon pamphlets, printed in the 1460s, say the boyars laughed at the question. The Slavic chronicles, written in Russia decades later, say they answered honestly. Some had lived through 7 voivodes, some through 10, some through more. The Romanian folk songs, collected in the 19th century, say one old boyar, prouder than the others, boasted that he had seen 30 princes come and go. Vlad listened. Then he said, in a voice that the Saxon pamphlets describe as soft, "And you imagine you will see another." The doors of the great hall were already closed. The Wallachian historian Florescu, working with the surviving documentary evidence, estimates that there were between 400 and 500 boyars and their family members in the hall that morning. The old men, the ones who had counted the most princes, were taken outside into the courtyard and impaled before noon. Roughly 50 of them, according to the Saxon source. The bodies were placed on the road south of Targovishte to be visible from the city walls. The younger boyars, and the wives, and the older children were spared the stake. They were given a different fate. They were marched, in the clothes they had worn to the Easter banquet, 60 miles north into the Carpathian foothills, to the half-ruined citadel above the Argeș River. They were told they were going to rebuild it. The march took 3 days. The records do not say whether they were given food, or shoes, or any acknowledgement of who they were. They arrived at the foot of the 1,480 steps in their silk gowns, with their gold rings still on their fingers, and they began to carry stone. This is the chapter of the Vlad story that the horror films almost never show, because it is more disturbing than impalement. Impalement is a single act of violence, terrible, immediate, finite. The work at Poenari was a slower thing. It took months. The boyars carried stone up the steps in the rain, in the snow, in the summer heat. They mixed mortar, they cut timber. The wedding silk on their backs rotted, and they kept working in the rags. The gold rings were taken from them, melted down, and used to gild the prince's new chapel. The records, such as they are, suggest the work continued from late spring of 1457 until the autumn of the same year. Some of the boyars died of exhaustion. Some died of disease in the makeshift camps below the cliff. Some, the strongest, finished the work and were sent home to their empty houses in Targovist with the message, "The prince has rebuilt his fortress, and your debt to him is paid." But beneath this strange mercy hid another story. The boyars who survived were never again invited to court. Their lands were redistributed to men loyal to Vlad personally, soldiers from his Transylvanian campaign, second sons of foreign families, men who owed everything to the prince and nothing to the old aristocracy. The boyar class that had murdered Vlad's father was, by the end of 1457, functionally extinct as a political force. A new nobility had been created in less than a year, owing its rank not to ancient lineage but to a single living man. Some historians have called this the first centralized state in the Balkans. Some have called it the first totalitarian moment in Eastern European history. The medievalist Matei Kazaku, working in Paris in the 1980s, called it a small experiment in the abolition of memory. Whatever you call it, the citadel that came out of it was different from the one that had stood there before. Its walls were 10 feet thick. 5 towers rose from the curtain wall. A new keep dominated the center. A chapel had been built and gilded. A tunnel had been dug from the inner court down through the limestone, exiting at the bank of the Argesh River, a tunnel of which we will hear more later. And the prince, who had inherited a ruin, now had a private kingdom no one would ever dare enter again. The Poenari that you can visit today, or more accurately, the Poenari that you can see from the road below, since access is restricted on most days for safety reasons, is roughly 70% the citadel Vlad rebuilt. Earthquakes in 1888 and 1913 destroyed the rest. But the floor plan is known, the dimensions are documented, and a careful archaeological survey conducted between 1969 and 1972 by the Romanian Institute of Archaeology produced measurements that allow us to picture the place as it stood in the late 1450s. It was not large. The citadel covered roughly 1,500 square meters, about a third of an acre. By comparison, Bran Castle, the one the tourists visit, covers nearly 4,000. Poenari was small because the cliff was small. The fortress had to fit on the limestone hatchet blade, and the limestone did not negotiate. But what it lacked in size, it compensated for in position. From the highest tower, on a clear day, a watcher could see 30 miles in 3 directions. The Argesh River, narrow and fast, ran 1,000 feet below. The only land approach was the spine of rock connecting Poenari to the main ridge, 6 feet wide at its narrowest, walked in single file. A defender at the gatehouse could hold off 10 attackers indefinitely, simply by virtue of the geometry. There was no flanking position, there was no siege engine that could be brought up the cliff. The only way to take Poenari was to starve it out. Inside the walls, Vlad built for himself a residence that surprised the Italian and Greek travelers who occasionally wrote about it later in the 15th century. There were carpets, there were Venetian glass windows in the chapel which must have been carried up the 1,480 steps by men whose hands trembled the entire way. There was a library, small, perhaps 30 manuscripts, but a library. Vlad, the Walukian voivode who history would remember as a monster, was apparently literate in 4 languages: Romanian, Slavonic, Latin, and Turkish. The library contained works in all 4. There were also less peaceful furnishings: a forge for repairing armor, an armory holding, by one Hungarian visitor's count, swords enough for 300 men, stables, barracks, a cistern fed by a spring that, remarkably, still flows today, 600 years after the citadel was abandoned, and the chapel, gilded with the melted-down rings of the Targovist boyars. This was the kingdom Vlad had built. Not a great kingdom. Wallachia in 1458 was a tiny state on the margin of 2 empires, with no money, no port, no navy, and a population that historians estimate at no more than 500,000 souls. But within its borders, Vlad had created something the Balkans had not seen before: a single absolute authority, untempered by aristocratic veto, defended from a private fortress no rival could approach. He used the next 4 years to test what such an authority could do. He executed merchants who used short measures. He executed thieves regardless of the value of what they had stolen. He executed Saxons in the Transylvanian trading towns who refused to pay his customs duties, And the Saxons, who would later write the most savage pamphlets about him, never forgave him for this. He executed gypsies, he executed beggars. By one Saxon account, he invited the poor of Targovist to a feast, fed them well, asked them whether they wished to be free of all human cares forever, accepted what may have been an ambiguous answer, and then locked the doors and burned the building down. That last story, we should say plainly, may not be true. It appears only in hostile Saxon sources, written years after Vlad's death, in a tradition of anti-Wallachian pamphleteering that had its own motivations. But the pattern it describes, the use of mass violence not as a battlefield tactic, but as an instrument of governance, is consistent with everything we can verify from neutral or friendly sources. Wallachia in 1460, by every contemporary account, was the safest country in the Balkans for an ordinary peasant to walk alone at night. It was also a country in which roughly 1 in 20 adult men had been killed by the state in the space of 3 years. You may decide for yourself what the right ratio is between safety and the methods used to produce it. The Wallachian peasants, when asked centuries later by folklorists who collected their songs, generally answered that they would take their voivode back any time he was offered. But not everyone agreed. In the spring of 1461, a letter arrived at Poenari from Constantinople. It was from Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of the city he had taken 8 years earlier. The letter requested tribute. The tribute had not been paid in 7 years. Vlad answered the letter in a way that made war inevitable. To understand the war that came to Poenari, we need to spend a moment on the man who started it. Mehmed II had taken Constantinople in May of 1453 at the age of 21. It was an achievement that had eluded every Muslim ruler for 800 years. The walls of the Theodosian rampart had been considered unbreakable since the 5th century. Mehmed broke them in 53 days, using cannon cast specifically for the purpose by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, whose offer of services Constantinople had earlier refused. The story is not directly relevant to Poenari, but it illustrates something important about Mehmed. He listened to engineers, he paid them well, and he was prepared to spend any amount of money to achieve a strategic objective. By 1461, Mehmed had also taken Trebizond, the last surviving Greek empire on the Black Sea. He had taken most of Serbia, he had taken most of Bosnia. He had begun the long campaigns that would eventually take him into Albania, where Skanderbeg would hold him off for another 2 decades, and into the Aegean, where Venice would lose island after island. He was, by any measurement available to a contemporary, the most successful military commander in Europe and the Middle East. He was also 30 years old, in good health, and at the height of his strategic ambitions. Wallachia, in this context, was a small problem. The tribute Mehmed wanted from Vlad was 10,000 ducats per year, and 500 boys for the Janissary Corps, the Ottoman elite infantry, recruited as Christian children and converted to Islam in service. Vlad's father had paid this tribute. Vlad himself technically had paid it during the brief 2-month reign of 1448. Since taking the throne in 1456, he had paid nothing. The letter from Mehmed in 1461 was a formal demand. Pay the 7 years of arrears. Send the boys. Come to Constantinople in person to renew the oath of vassalage. Vlad's reply, which has not survived in its exact wording but is described in 3 independent sources, was that he would meet the Ottoman ambassadors at his frontier with the appropriate honors. When the ambassadors arrived, there were 2 of them, plus a small escort. Vlad asked them courteously why they did not remove their turbans in his presence. The ambassadors replied that it was the custom of their religion to keep their heads covered. Vlad said he understood completely and that he wished to help them keep this custom forever. He then had their turbans nailed to their heads. The detail of the nails, 3 nails per ambassador, hammered through the cloth and into the scalp, comes from the chronicler Leonicus Chalkokondoulas, a Greek source generally considered reliable, writing within 2 decades of the event. It also appears in the Slavic chronicle attributed to a Russian monk named Ephrsin. It does not appear in the Saxon pamphlets, which is mildly significant. The Saxons would have included it if they had known it, and the fact that they did not suggests it was not a propaganda invention, but an actual event that traveled by word of mouth eastward into Russia and Greece without reaching the German trading cities. Mehmed received the news in Constantinople. He understood it for what it was: a declaration of war, delivered in the most public and humiliating manner possible. But beneath this calculated provocation hid another story. Vlad was not foolish. He had been raised in the Ottoman court, he knew exactly what Mehmed would do and roughly how many men he would bring. He knew that Wallachia, with its population of 500,000, could not field an army to match. He knew that Poenari, however well positioned, could not hold against an Ottoman siege if the Ottomans were prepared to wait. So he was not planning to fight Mehmed conventionally. He was planning something else. That winter, the winter of 1461 into 1462, Vlad crossed the frozen Danube with 5,000 cavalry and burned every Ottoman fort, town, and supply depot on the south bank for a stretch of 120 miles. The Ottoman chronicler Tursun Beg, writing for the imperial court, gives the casualty count: 23,884 killed. We should treat the precision of that number with caution. Pre-modern body counts almost always round up, but multiple independent Greek and Hungarian sources confirm the scale. It was the largest cross-border raid the Balkans had seen in living memory. Vlad sent the news to Pope Pius II in Rome, asking for Crusader support. He sent the news to Matthias Corvinus, the new king of Hungary, asking for an army. He sent the news to his cousin Stephen in Moldavia, asking for cavalry. None of them sent anything. In the spring of 1462, Mehmed crossed the Danube with an army that contemporary sources estimate at between 60 and 90,000 men, supported by a Black Sea fleet of 120 galleys ferrying supplies up the coast. It was, by some measures, the second largest army Mehmed ever personally commanded. The largest had been the one he led against the walls of Constantinople 9 years earlier. He was bringing it now against a prince who could at best raise 30,000 men, defending a citadel that fit on the head of a limestone hatchet. Vlad had spent the winter preparing the road from the Danube to Targovist in a manner that no one in the Ottoman command had quite anticipated. The Sultan was about to walk into the forest of stakes. Tursun Beg was a secretary in Mehmed's household. He had served the Sultan since before Constantinople. He had a court historian's appetite for flattery and a soldier's eye for what actually happened on a campaign. His chronicle, written in Persian sometime in the 1480s, is not a sympathetic source for Vlad. It is the closest thing we have, however, to an Ottoman eyewitness account of what the imperial army found outside Targovist in June of 1462. Tursun Beg writes, and I will paraphrase from the Persian rather than quote, because the original passage is long and the manuscript tradition is contested, that as the army approached the Wallachian capital, an unusual smell reached the vanguard about half a day's march from the city. The Sultan, riding near the front, sent scouts ahead to investigate. The scouts returned and did not at first speak. Mehmed gave the order to advance. What the army came upon, in Tursun Beg's words, was a field beside the road approximately 2 miles in length and roughly a mile across. In the field stood approximately 20,000 vertical wooden stakes. On each stake was the body of a man, a woman, or a child. The bodies were in varying stages of decomposition. The oldest had been there for perhaps 5 or 6 weeks, the freshest for a few days. They had been impaled through the torso so that the stake exited the upper body, then driven into the ground so that the bodies hung at varying heights. The heights, by some readings of the source, deliberately arranged in concentric circles with the most senior captives at the center. Tursun Beg says that the captives had been Ottoman soldiers and Bulgarian Christians captured during Vlad's winter raid across the Danube. The Saxon pamphlets, which had reached Europe by then, agreed on the identification of the captives and provided different but roughly compatible numbers. Chalka Condyles, the Greek source, gave a higher count, somewhere around 25,000, and noted that crows had been roosting on the stakes for so long that the field appeared, from a distance, to move. Mehmed II had personally overseen the sack of Constantinople. He had personally signed off on the massacres at Mistra and Trebizond. He had, by his own court historian's admission, supervised executions of his own brothers and nephews to secure his throne. He was not a man who could be shocked by mass violence. But beneath this hardened campaign veteran exterior, Tursun Beg says, and here the chronicler is being unusually candid, the Sultan turned to his viziers and said, in effect, that any man who could do this to his own captives could not be defeated in the open field by ordinary means. The Ottoman army camped that night 5 miles back from the field of stakes. In the morning, Mehmed gave the order to withdraw. He had not yet fought a single battle in Wallachia. He had not even reached the capital, which was, in fact, undefended. Vlad had emptied Targovist of soldiers a week earlier. The road was open, the crown was sitting unguarded in the palace. By every conventional logic of 15th century campaigning, Mehmed should have walked into the city, installed a puppet voivode, and continued north. He turned the army around. What we cannot know, what no historian, however careful, can tell you, is exactly why. The field of stakes alone is not a sufficient explanation. Mehmed had seen worse. Some sources suggest that supply problems had made the position untenable. The Black Sea Fleet had been damaged in storms. The summer heat had begun to spread dysentery through the Janissaries. The Hungarian army, contrary to Vlad's belief, was finally on the move from Buda. Mehmed may have feared being caught between two forces, or perhaps Tursun Beg, who knew the Sultan personally, was telling the truth. Perhaps the field outside Tergovishte had simply communicated something that no Ottoman commander wanted to test further. The army recrossed the Danube in the last week of June 1462. Vlad had won. Wallachia, against odds that no contemporary observer would have given better than 10-1, had pushed back the conqueror of Constantinople. He should have been the hero of Christendom. Pope Pius II, in a private letter, wrote that Vlad had saved Hungary, perhaps Italy, from the immediate Turkish advance. Bonfires were lit in Genoa. A new crusade was preached in Venice, and within 4 months, Vlad would be in chains. We have not yet told you the part of the campaign that the chroniclers admired most, because it does not fit easily in the Field of Stakes chapter, and deserves its own. On the night of the 17th of June, 1462, while Mehmed's army was still advancing toward Targovist and had not yet seen the field, Vlad attempted to end the war in a single stroke. He had, by this point, withdrawn into the forests with what remained of his cavalry. The Ottoman army was camped in 3 concentric rings outside its forward position, about a day's march south of Targovist. The Sultan's tent was at the center. Vlad knew the standard Ottoman encampment plan. He had been raised inside it as a boy. He took 5,000 men and rode them, in absolute silence, around the western flank of the Ottoman camp in the hour before midnight. The plan, according to the Polish chronicler Jan Długosz, was simple. Ride straight through the camp in a wedge formation, find Mehmed's tent, kill the Sultan, ride out the eastern side, and disappear into the forest. If Mehmed died, the Ottoman army would dissolve. The war would be over. Wallachia would survive. It almost worked. Vlad's cavalry struck the western perimeter of the camp at midnight. They cut through the outer ring of Anatolian auxiliaries in less than 10 minutes. They reached the second ring of Janissaries by 12:30. By 1 in the morning, they were in the inner camp, surrounded by the personal tents of the Ottoman command staff. They could not find the Sultan's tent. There are several theories about why. The Ottoman court historians, writing decades later, claimed that Mehmed had moved his tent that very afternoon, an act of routine paranoia that saved his life. The Romanian folk tradition holds that Vlad had been betrayed. One of his 5,000 cavalrymen was an Ottoman agent who deliberately led the wedge into the wrong sector of the camp. The most boring explanation, which Mortimer Becker and other modern historians favor, is that Ottoman camps in 1462 were enormous and confusing, and finding a specific tent in the dark while being attacked from all sides was simply much harder than Vlad had calculated. Whatever the reason, by 2 in the morning, Vlad had failed to find Mehmed and was now fighting his way out of an Ottoman camp that had fully awakened. He lost perhaps 2,000 men. He lost his second in command. He himself was, by one source, wounded twice, once in the thigh, once in the shoulder. He escaped by riding east, away from the planned exit route, through a sector where the Ottoman defenses had not yet been organized. By dawn, he was back in the forest with 3,000 men. The Sultan was alive. The war was not over. But beneath this military failure hid another story. The night attack had a psychological consequence the Ottoman command did not officially record, but that Tursun Beg hints at indirectly. The Sultan now knew that the Wallachian voivode was willing to attempt his personal assassination on the battlefield. He now knew that 5,000 Wallachian cavalry could ride through 3 rings of Ottoman defenses in 2 hours. He now knew that whatever he had thought about the size of the army he was facing, he was wrong. Vlad was not retreating because he was weak. He was retreating because he had a plan, and the plan included the Sultan's death. This knowledge, combined with what would arrive at Mehmed's eyes 2 weeks later in the form of the Field of Stakes, is, in the view of some historians, the actual reason the Sultan withdrew. Not the field alone, the field plus the night attack. The field plus the knowledge that the man capable of impaling 20,000 of his soldiers was also capable of riding straight at him in the dark with the explicit intention of putting a sword through his neck. It is rare for a 15th-century campaign to have a single psychological moment that turns the strategic calculation. The night attack at Targovishte was, by every available reading, exactly that moment. It was the closest a Christian commander would come to killing an Ottoman sultan in the field for the next 400 years. And it would also, in a way the historians have only recently begun to acknowledge, lay the groundwork for everything that came next. Because the Sultan, having withdrawn from Wallachia, did not simply go home. He left someone behind. When Mehmed recrossed the Danube in late June of 1462, he left in Wallachia a small Ottoman force of approximately 8,000 men, supported by a Wallachian pretender whose claim to the throne was, in strict dynastic terms, as valid as Vlad's. The pretender's name was Radu. He was Vlad's younger brother. He had not left Edirne when Vlad had left it. He had stayed, and he had grown up in the Ottoman court, and he had converted to Islam, and he had become, by every contemporary account, one of the most beautiful young men of the Ottoman elite. He was called Radu Selfrumos, Radu the Handsome. The Greek and Italian sources, writing from a Christian perspective, are sometimes uncomfortable about Radu, and the discomfort takes a particular shape. There are persistent rumors, traceable to Chalco condyles and repeated by several later chroniclers, that the young Radu had been the lover of Mehmed himself during their years together in Edirne. The chronicler Chalco condyles describes a specific incident: Mehmed pursuing the young Radu through the palace, Radu fleeing up a tree, Mehmed eventually winning his consent. Whether the account is true, partly true, or wholly invented by a Greek source hostile to the Sultan, the rumor was widespread enough that even Ottoman court sources, which would have had every reason to suppress it, acknowledge an unusually close relationship between the two men. What is documented beyond doubt is this: Radu, in 1462, returned to Wallachia at the head of an Ottoman army, having spent 15 years at the personal court of his brother's mortal enemy. The boyars, what was left of them, came to him. The boyars had not forgotten Poenari. They had not forgotten the silk gowns rotting on their wives' backs. They had not forgotten the gold rings in the chapel ceiling. They had not, in particular, forgotten that the prince who had done this to them was still alive, still on the throne, and still surrounded by men loyal only to him personally. Radu offered them what Vlad had taken: their lands, their titles, their old roles at court. He offered them, in addition, the protection of the Ottoman state, the same Ottoman state that, 2 months earlier, had been their nominal enemy. The boyars switched sides over the course of a single summer. By August of 1462, Vlad had perhaps 2,000 men still loyal to him. By September, perhaps 1,000. He withdrew, with what was left, to Poenari. The fortress had been built for exactly this circumstance: the 1,480 steps, the single approach along the spine of rock, the cistern fed by the spring, the armory with swords for 300 men. Vlad had perhaps 300 men. The math, for a long moment, looked manageable. What he had not planned for was that his brother knew the fortress as well as he did. They had played in its ruined courtyards as children before Edirne. They had hidden in its dry cisterns. They had, perhaps in some long-forgotten childhood summer, mapped out together the network of caves that ran beneath the limestone cliff, caves that were not, strictly speaking, part of the citadel above, but which connected in places to its lower foundations. In the autumn of 1462, Radu's Ottoman force arrived at the base of the 1,480 steps. They did not climb them. They camped at the foot of the cliff, and, according to a Wallachian source dating from roughly 30 years later, they waited until darkness, and then they brought up archers from the bend of the Argesh River, the riverside of the cliff, the side everyone had always considered unassailable, and they fired arrows up at the citadel walls with messages wrapped around the shafts. The messages were not addressed to Vlad. They were addressed to the women inside. We know there was at least one woman inside Poenari that autumn. Wallachian tradition gives her a name, Knejna, or sometimes Ilona, and identifies her as Vlad's first wife. The historical documentation is thin. We have no marriage contract. We have no contemporary description. We have, in the Imperial Ottoman archives, a single oblique reference to the Lady of the Prince being inside the fortress during the siege. That is all. But we have, in the river that flows beneath the North Tower, a name that has lasted 600 years. Raul Domani. The Lady's River. The story, as the Wallachian peasants told it for centuries before any historian wrote it down, is this. On the second or third night of the siege of Poenari, accounts differ on the exact date, an arrow came over the walls into the inner courtyard with a piece of parchment wrapped around its shaft. The arrow was found, the parchment was read, the message was delivered to the Lady of the Prince in her chamber in the North Tower. The message said, in Wallachian, that the Ottoman army at the base of the cliff would not climb the steps. It would not need to. Within a week, supplies of food at the foot of the cliff would be cut off entirely. Within 2 weeks, the cistern would be poisoned from upstream. Within 3 weeks, the people inside the citadel would begin to starve. Within a month, the men loyal to the prince would do what starving men have always done. The lady would be handed over. She would be taken to Edirne. She would become the property of the Ottoman court. The message was signed by Radu, by her brother-in-law, in his own hand. The lady, according to the song the peasants sang, read the message and then stood for a long time at the narrow window of her chamber. The window overlooked the gorge. The fall to the Argesh River was approximately 300 feet. The river at that point ran fast and shallow. Death, on impact with the rocks, would be instant. She is said to have said, and here the folk tradition gives her actual words, which no historian can verify, but which have been sung in the Argesh Valley for centuries, that she would rather her body fed the fish of the Argesh than her flesh fed the appetites of the Sultan. She stepped from the window. In the morning, her body was recovered downstream by a village fisherman. The river, which had no name before that day, was given hers. It has had her name ever since. We have no contemporary corroboration of this story. We have only the river's name, which is real, and which appears in Wallachian land deeds from the late 15th century onward. The name predates any of the literary versions of the story by several decades, which is, in itself, mildly significant. Folk tradition does not usually invent the names of rivers, it preserves them. The medievalist Matej Kazaku, in his 1996 study of the VLAD sources, takes a careful middle position. He notes that there was certainly a woman inside Poenari, that she certainly did not survive the siege, and that the river certainly bears a name that points to her death. He stops short of confirming the specific manner of that death. The arrow, the message, the leap, these belong to the folk tradition, not the documentary record. But the folk tradition is, in many cases, all we have. The Romanian peasants who sang the song were not historians. They were the descendants of the men who had carried the boyar bodies down the cliff in 1462. They had no reason to invent a lady who jumped. They had every reason to remember one who did. Was it a curse? Was it a calculation? Was it the inevitable consequence of a man who had asked his wife to live in a fortress he had built with the corpses of an aristocracy? Some say she jumped, some say she was pushed. Some say there was no lady at all, only a river that needed a name, and a peasant village that needed a story about a noblewoman whose pride had outlasted her husband's army. The river runs in the same bed today that it ran in 1462. The fishermen still pull trout from it in the spring. The fortress above is silent. Vlad himself, after his wife's death, did not stay to die in his citadel. He did what the tunnel had been built for. There is, beneath the limestone cliff at Poenari, a system of natural caves. The 1971 archaeological survey mapped roughly 600 meters of accessible passage. The full system is larger, perhaps 2 or 3 kilometers, but the rest is unstable and has not been explored since the early 20th century. Connecting the inner courtyard of the citadel to this cave system was a single artificial tunnel. It had been cut, according to the Wallachian chronicler Radu Popescu writing in the 17th century, by the boyar prisoners during the 1457 reconstruction. The tunnel descended at a steep angle for approximately 120 meters, emerging through a narrow fissure half concealed by trees at a point on the riverbank about a quarter-mile downstream of the foot of the 1,480 steps. It was, in modern terms, an emergency exit. On the night his wife died, or perhaps the night after, Vlad took the tunnel. He came out at the river. He had with him, by various accounts, between 12 and 20 of his most trusted men. He crossed the Argesh on horseback, swimming the horses through the cold autumn water. He climbed the far side of the gorge. He disappeared into the Carpathian forests in the direction of Transylvania. The Ottoman army at the base of the cliff did not realize he was gone for at least 3 days. By the time they did, he was 60 miles north, well into Habsburg territory. He had escaped his brother. He had escaped Mehmed. He had survived the war he had started by nailing 3 turbans to 2 Ottoman ambassadors. He had not, however, escaped politics. When Vlad reached the Hungarian court of Matthias Corvinus at Buda, expecting refuge and the support of a fellow Christian monarch, he found instead that Matthias had decided to solve a different problem. The Hungarian king had been criticized in Rome for failing to support Vlad's anti-Ottoman campaign. Letters from Pope Pius II had grown sharp. Matthias needed to explain why he had taken no action during the events of 1462. He produced 3 letters, written in Vlad's hand, addressed to Sultan Mehmed, offering submission and an alliance against Hungary. The letters were forgeries. We know this now. The forensic analysis, conducted in the 1970s, showed that the handwriting was a clumsy imitation, that the Latin was wrong in characteristic ways for a court scribe, and that one of the dates referenced an event that had not yet occurred at the time the letter was supposedly written. But in 1462, the letters were enough. Matthias arrested Vlad as a traitor to the Christian cause and threw him into prison. Vlad spent the next 12 years in Hungarian custody. The conditions are debated. Some Hungarian sources describe him as a guest of the king, living in a comfortable apartment in the castle of Visegrad. Other sources describe a tower cell, isolation, and chains. The truth was probably somewhere between initial harsh imprisonment, then a gradual softening as Matthias's political needs changed. By 1474, Matthias had decided he needed Vlad alive and useful again. The Ottoman threat to Hungary had revived. The puppet voivode Radu had died of syphilis in 1475. Wallachia was, once more, available. Vlad was released. He was given a new wife, a cousin of King Matthias, a member of the Hungarian Szilágyi family. He was given a small army, and in November of 1476, he crossed the mountains back into Wallachia with Stephen the Great of Moldavia at his side, and retook the throne his brother had stolen from him 14 years earlier. He held it for 2 months. In late December of 1476, while patrolling near Bucharest with a small escort, he was ambushed by a force of either boyars loyal to the previous Ottoman-backed voivode or Ottoman irregulars, or perhaps both at once. He died fighting. The chronicler Jan Długosz, working with reports brought back by a Polish ambassador who had been in Wallachia that winter, says Vlad killed 5 men around him before he was cut down. The number is probably exaggerated. The death is not. His head was cut off. It was preserved in a jar of honey to keep it from decomposing on the long journey south. It was sent to Constantinople, to Sultan Mehmed II, as a gift. Mehmed received the head in February or March of 1477. We know this because a Venetian diplomatic dispatch sent from the Sultan's court to the Doge in Venice on the 4th of April that year mentions the head being displayed on a stake outside the Topkapi Palace gates for the inspection of the city. The Sultan, the dispatch says, expressed satisfaction. What happened to the body, to Vlad's body, the body of the Prince of Wallachia, the voivode of the Field of Stakes, the man who had once nearly killed a sultan in his own tent, is a question that has occupied Romanian historians for 500 years. There is no surviving record. There is no grave that can be confirmed. The traditional Romanian answer is the monastery of Snagov, on an island in a lake about 30 miles north of Bucharest. The monastery was founded in the 14th century and was actively patronized by Vlad during his second reign. There is a tomb inside the church, near the altar, that local tradition has long identified as Vlad's. The tomb is unmarked. In 1933, the Romanian archaeologist Dinu Rossetti opened the tomb. It was empty. There were no bones. There was no clothing. There was no indication that anyone had ever been buried there. The cavity beneath the slab contained the bones of several animals, primarily pig and horse, and a small amount of 19th century debris, consistent with the slab having been lifted at some point during the monastery's many renovations. Rossetti, who had expected to find VLAD, did not know how to interpret the absence. He published a brief report in Romanian and then returned to other work. The empty tomb has been re-examined twice since, in 1976 and in 2003, and the result has been the same each time. Nothing under the slab. Nothing in the church floor around it. Nothing in the surrounding crypts. We have, therefore, three possibilities for what happened to VLAD's body, none of which can be confirmed. The first possibility is that VLAD was buried at Snagov, in the traditional location, and the body was removed in the early 19th century, perhaps during the Russian occupation of 1828, perhaps during the Romanian revolutionary period of 1848, perhaps simply by a thief who knew where to dig. There is no evidence for this, but it is the simplest explanation. The second possibility is that VLAD was never at Snagov at all. The local tradition, which is the only basis for the identification, may have arisen later, attached itself to an unmarked tomb that happened to be conveniently positioned, and become so entrenched that no one questioned it until Rossetti opened the slab. The third possibility is the one that the folk tradition prefers, and that historians treat with the most skepticism, and that the comments section of any video about VLAD will fill within an hour of posting. It is that the body was never buried because it was never recovered, that the head went to Constantinople, but the rest of VLAD, the rest of the Prince of Wallachia, was taken away from the battlefield by men who did not want his enemies to find it, and was hidden somewhere in the Carpathian forests, in a grave whose location was passed orally from generation to generation and was eventually lost. The folk version is unprovable. It is also, given everything else we know about VLAD's life, oddly plausible. He was a man whose entire reign had been organized around the principle that his enemies should not be permitted the satisfaction of finishing him. It would be very much in character for his last loyal men to deny Mehmed the body, even after they had failed to deny him the head. Whichever of the three possibilities you prefer, the result is the same. VLAD III, Prince of Wallachia, has no confirmed grave. He has, instead, a citadel on a cliff that nobody visits, a river named for a woman whose existence is half mythical, and a literary reputation built by an Irish novelist who never came to Romania. Which brings us, finally, to Bran. Bram Stoker began writing Dracula in March of 1890. He finished it in 1897. In those 7 years he made no journey to Romania. He had never visited Wallachia. He had never seen the Carpathian Mountains in person. He had never met a Romanian. What he had was the British Museum reading room. Stoker's reading notes for Dracula survive, and they are now held at the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. They show, in his own hand, exactly which sources he consulted and exactly which details he took from each. The Carpathian geography came from Charles Boner's 1865 travel book Transylvania, Its Products and Its People. The Romanian folklore came from Emily Gerard's 1885 article, Transylvanian Superstitions, in the 19th Century magazine. The historical VLAD, the actual Wallachian voivode, came from a single passing reference in William Wilkinson's 1820 book An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, which mentioned Voivode Dracula in connection with a 15th century war against the Turks. That is all. One paragraph in a 60-year-old British diplomatic memoir. Stoker took the name, he took the dates, he took the Carpathian setting. He did not take Poenari because he had no idea Poenari existed. He did not take the Field of Stakes because Wilkinson's account did not mention it. He invented a castle in Transylvania, which is, geographically, the wrong country. Wallachia is south of the Carpathians, Transylvania is north, and he located it somewhere in the Borgo Pass, which is a real pass in northern Transylvania that he had read about in Gerard. He never named the specific castle. The novel describes the Count's castle in vague Gothic terms, broken battlements, deep valleys, isolation, and gives no map coordinates, no Romanian place name, no specific architectural detail. Bran Castle, the castle the tourists visit, sits in the southern Carpathians at the border between Wallachia and Transylvania. It was built by the Teutonic Knights in 1212, rebuilt by the Hungarian crown in 1377, and used by various Hungarian-aligned governors over the centuries. There is one documented instance of Vlad III being inside it. A Hungarian record from 1462 places him there, as a prisoner, for approximately 2 months on his way from Wallachia to King Matthias's court at Visegrad. He did not live there, he did not own it. He did not, as far as any contemporary source records, do anything memorable inside it. What Bran had, and Poenari did not, was a road. In 1920, the city of Brașov gave Bran Castle as a gift to Queen Marie of Romania, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She used it as a summer residence and renovated extensively. By the 1930s, with the Romanian royal family in residence and a paved road leading to the gates, Bran had become a destination for European tourists. In 1965, Nicolae Ceausescu took power in communist Romania. By the early 1970s, his government had identified Bram Stoker's Dracula, by then a successful Hollywood franchise, as a tourism opportunity. The decision was made to position Bran Castle, with its existing road and its existing royal-era infrastructure, as Dracula's castle. The fact that the historical Vlad had spent 2 months there as a prisoner, and that Bram Stoker's fictional count was an entirely different character with a vaguely located fictional castle, was, in tourism marketing terms, a manageable problem. Poenari was an unmanageable problem. The 1,480 steps could not be paved. The cliff was geologically unstable. The 1888 and 1913 earthquakes had brought half the citadel down into the gorge. There was no parking, there was no infrastructure, there was no road, and there could not be one. The Romanian state, between 1972 and 1981, partially stabilized Poenari with steel cables and concrete reinforcements. They built the 1,480 wooden steps that lead up the cliff today, replacing the older stone steps that had eroded. They added a small information plaque at the summit, and they made the decision, quietly, without ever announcing it as policy, to let the tourists go to Bran. Today, Bran receives roughly 2.5 million visitors per year. Poenari, in a good year, receives perhaps 40,000. The local Argesh guides who lead the climb up the steps will tell you, if you ask, that the wrong castle has the name, that Vlad was here, on this cliff, not at Bran, that the boyars carried the stones for the walls you are standing inside, that the river below is called the Ladies' River for a reason. Most tourists don't ask. They have already been to Bran. They are looking for the gift shop. But beneath this comfortable arrangement hid another story. The historical record, the real one, with the field of stakes and the ambassadors' turbans and the night attack and the brother who came home wearing Ottoman colors, has been quietly preserved by Romanian historians for 150 years. They have not lost it. They have only watched it be slowly replaced, in the international imagination, by an Irish novelist's Gothic shorthand. Whether the historians are content with this arrangement is a different question. The Romanian historian Constantin Răzăcevici, who spent 50 years working on the Vlad sources, used to say in interviews that the great tragedy of Wallachia was not what its prince had done. It was that the world remembered him for the wrong reasons. If you climb the 1,480 steps today, in summer, in good weather, when the cliff is stable enough to permit visitors, and these conditions do not always coincide, you will reach the top in roughly 40 minutes, if you are fit, or an hour and a half if you are not. The steps are wooden, replaced every 15 years or so by the Romanian state. The original stone steps lie underneath, worn smooth by the boyars' feet and by 500 years of subsequent weather. At the top, you will find a partially restored citadel. 2 of the original 5 towers still stand. The curtain wall is largely intact on the eastern side and largely collapsed on the western. The chapel is gone, only the foundation remains, with a single corner of the gilded ceiling preserved in the local museum at Curtea de Argeș. The cistern still holds water, fed by the same spring that has fed it since the 13th century. There is no guide, there is no shop, there is a single laminated information board, in Romanian, English, and French, which gives a brief summary of the citadel's history. The summary does not mention the field of stakes, it does not mention the night attack, it does not mention the Ladies' River. It mentions only that the citadel was an important fortification during the reign of Vlad Tepes, and that visitors are advised not to lean over the edges of the towers. Imagine standing in the inner courtyard, on stones that were carried up the cliff by men in wedding silks. The wind comes through the broken east wall and moves across the open space and exits through the south gate. The Argesh River, 1,000 feet below, is just audible, a thin, steady sound. There are jackdaws on the highest tower. There is, in the corner where the chapel used to be, a single wild rose growing through the floor. A man stood on these stones in the autumn of 1462 and decided to leave through a tunnel. A woman, perhaps, stood at a window in the north tower and decided to step out of it. A prince stood in the gilded chapel and watched his enemy's rings burn down into the gold above him. A brother climbed the cliff with 8,000 Ottoman soldiers and stayed at the bottom because he knew, from childhood, that the only way to take this fortress was to wait. 2.5 million people this year will go to Bran instead. The citadel on the cliff has been empty for 560 years. The Argesh still runs beneath the north tower. The locals still call it the Ladies' River. Whether a woman threw herself from those stones in the spring of 1462, or whether a folk song invented her to give the river a name, the records do not say. The records were burned, or never written, or written by men who hated him, or written by men who served him. Take your pick. 80 miles south, the tour buses unload at Bran. The garlic sellers smile. A novelist who never came to Romania picked the wrong castle, and a country that needed the money let him. The man himself, the prince, the impaler, the voivode, the monster, sleeps somewhere unknown. His head went to Constantinople in a jar of honey. His body was never found. Some say it was buried at the monastery at Snagov. Some say the grave there is empty. The citadel on the cliff keeps its own council. It always has.